Hey guys, Zack here, and this is my review of Trollhunters Tales of Arcadia. Okay, so this is a new season with a new storyline. But this episode does continue onward with what happened last time about how Jim went into the Darklands alone, so that none of the rest of his friends don't wind up getting hurt, and he has all three of the Triumphant Stones. So he also has the Eclipse Sword, which means that. And I also didn't picture that last time, so I'm gonna picture it here. But essentially, yeah, this episode is about Jim's quests in the Darklands and his friend's quest to save him. And this episode, and this one is important because this series well, first and foremost, Gunmar appears in the intro of this. They finally redo the intro for the series, which I do like. I think it stays this intro for the rest of the series, but essentially what this series is it establishes the series of dominoes that fall in such a way that Gunmar is able to escape the Darklands and return to power. That is essentially what the entire plot of this season is. Essentially, Jim going to the Darklands. It has a minor effect on that, but it's more. I mean, because obviously Jim's in the Darklands. Obviously, him being there means that his team is going to have to find a way to get him out and open the portal and pull him through and pull him to safety. But there's also a series of dominoes that just kind of get set up and fall down in such a way that it's not entirely Jim's fault. I'm going to open with that. It's not entirely Jim's fault that Gunmar gets out. It is somewhat his fault because he went in and then his friends getting him out was what enables Gunmar to get out. But it's not entirely his fault. There is a lot more at play than just simply Jim is the one who let Gunmar out. There's a lot more to it. And it is actually not really, and in fact, it's actually a bit of an overarching narrative thing with another group of characters who are somewhat introduced in this season and play a major role in it, and then are not play an important role afterward. But yeah, it's mainly because of this one group of characters that exists in the story. All characters we've seen, I should mention. All characters we have seen previously. But they are important because they are ultimately the ones that enable Gunmar to get out. And I will discuss them. But essentially the story opens up with Barbara going into Jim's room in the morning. She sees a note saying that he was sleeping in, that he had a long night, so she comes in to check on him, is surprised that he's not there. And then it's at this point where we see Jim in his room, which is weird. And obviously they establish that that's weird because obviously Jim isn't acting right. We see Jim and he's not acting like himself. He's acting very different than how we're used to him. But of course Jim, we'll get to that. But Jim goes on to explain how he's a little surprised that his mom is out, but he was just putting on his last sock and is about to go on his way to get to go back to school and get ready for everything. Jim, of course, Barbara is a little confused, but also points out that he's obviously very, that she obviously understands that he's been busy and decides to leave him be. But then he realizes that he needs to make her breakfast and proceeds to run downstairs to the kitchen. And this Jim is notably a lot more clumsy than he usually is, and we're getting to that. There's a reason for that, but also we may find out is that Jim inexplicably can no longer cook, which is an established part of his character. He's a really good cook, but yeah, he's stumbling around the kitchen. He's scrambling to make an omelet for Barbara because he is not doing a very good job at it, I should mention. And of course she wonders. Barbara wonders why he's working so hard when she can just is obviously seeing that he's struggling a little bit, but Jim insists that he's going to cook for her because she needs to get her memory, she needs to get her strength back up after her concussion and losing her memory, and of course he proceeds to make an omelet and make an omelet not well. Barbara admits that it feels like Jim has started taking some of her lessons from cooking, but also after tasting it and obviously having a very unpleasant face when she tastes it, does point out that it's definitely some concussion because she doesn't even remember when they redecorated the house. And sure enough, this is the whole aftermath of the house being completely destroyed during the fight with Angor Rot. That they do. There's also, I should mention, this is also a recap episode. So there's a lot of flashbacks to previous things Jim has done throughout the season. There's a lot of things to catch you up on what you missed. But we see a series of flashbacks. But in any case, we see a series of flashbacks with the Battle of Angor Rot, and he goes on, and they go on to explain how, and of course, Jim just kind of shrugs and points out that it's nothing to be worried about, but does point out that they admire the new wallpaper. But then Jim realizes that he's got to run and calls Barbara as he leaves Dr. L, which of course she becomes suspicious of, and then proceeds to get onto it. Jim proceeds to get onto his bike, and it quickly becomes apparent, and it should become apparent now that that obviously something is off with Jim. It should become apparent that this Jim is not. Well, it should be apparent, but it's very apparent that Jim is not acting like himself. And of course, this is this point where he meets up with Claire and at the front of the house, and Claire just kind of looks at him funny and tells him that they're late. That they're late, and of course she proceeds to, and of course he points out that keeping up appearances is hard, and that he really doesn't like it. But as they go through the canal, they get ready to go to the canal and proceed to part a little bit. To this point where we find out why Jim has been acting strange. As I've kind of hinted at, it's not really Jim. But at which point the Jim takes off a mask, and we see Toby holding what he describes as a glamour mask, and insists that Claire should be the one to be wearing it since she's a lot better at pretending to be Jim. And of course she insists that they made a deal. Toby would cover him for his activities in Arcadia, while she covers for him in Troll Market. But of course Toby points out that it's been hard, and he points out that Barbara almost found out. She came dangerously close to figuring out that Toby isn't actually her son. She came dangerously close to figuring out her son isn't actually her son. That's a much better way of putting what I just said. But in any case, in case Claire points out that it's been 2 weeks since Jim went into the Darklands, and the amulet hasn't called for anybody else, so they know he's alive. And points out that when he does eventually come back, he'll come back with her brother, which of course she's very excited about. But and of course Toby just points out that he can't take much more of pretending to be Jim, and wonders where the hell he is and why he's taking so long. At which point, it then does this cool camera flip thing where on the reverse side we see Jim in the Darklands, and he is poking around, and he's revealed to still be alive. And also it's revealed how he's been sustaining himself and eating and all those other things. But he's been poking around the Darklands. And he's been scavenging food. And what we find out is that Jim is currently looking for a food source, and that's what he finds. We are introduced to a creature named the Nyarlathotep, which is this big, dead-looking worm thing. It's a very cool thing, but it's this big-ass worm creature that lives in the Darklands. And Jim is currently trying to sneak past it so he can get into its nest and steal its eggs to eat. and he eventually does find its nest and winds up swiping them. But then he feels a presence, and then senses drool on him, and he turns around and discovers that the Gnarlagrath have since discovered that Jim is trying to steal its eggs. And Jim asks him if they can talk about it, very sarcastically, I should mention. But it's at this point where the Gnarlagrath just kind of charges at Jim and tries to attack him, and Jim uses his sword to defend himself, but he otherwise just kind of avoids it and evades it, and eventually gets to fall to a lower platform of the Darklands where it's unable to get back to him. But he does in the process wind up losing most of the eggs he stole from it. So yeah, unfortunately, Jim lost most of his food to the Gnarlagrath, and the Gnarlagrath is able to save most of its eggs and stores it in its mouth, and then proceeds to roar at Jim again. But by that point, Jim's long gone. At which point, Jim goes to his hideout that he's set up in the Darklands, and this is very sad. So Jim has first and foremost created a map of the Darklands so he can navigate his way around. We see a hand-drawn map of him navigating his way through the Darklands, figuring out where all of the twists and turns are, where he can find so he can find the Changeling Nursery and rescue Enrique and Extension and everybody else. But yeah, he has a hand-drawn map. And this is the sad part. Also, on the other wall, we see that he's drawn all of his loved ones on the wall and is talking to it to cope, which is a very sad thing. But of course he proceeds to offer his quote-unquote friends some of the Gnarlagrath egg once he cooks it. But also points out that he's realizing he's getting way too comfortable talking to himself. But and wishes they were and admits that he'll be back to see them again soon. But of course, as he finishes his egg, he goes outside of his hideout and asks where Enrique is, pointing out that there seems to be no end to the Darklands. And of course, the Darklands are like a massive labyrinth. So of course, Jim is not going to be able to find the Goblin Nursery easily. It's obviously going to be a bit of a struggle. But of course, as Jim is kind of musing to himself, we then see a reverse of this, where it then proceeds to flip back to Team Trollhunters' perspective, and we see Blinky doing essentially the exact same thing Jim is doing. He's drafting plans on his board, talking to himself, but also kind of sort of talking to Arg's corpse. He's talking to Arg, like Arg's statue has been propped up inside of his library, where he can just watch it, where you can just have him with him forever because he doesn't want to be apart from his friend, which is a very sad thing. But he starts talking to Arg, or what's left of him, and I should mention, Arg is still dead. It's sad, but he's still dead. And Blinky is talking to himself, talking to Arg, running across a series of plans where he's trying to figure out a good working one. His most recent one being that he plans to use the Shadow Staff's ability to create portals to try and transport their way into the Darklands, but then realizes that's not working and that's not going to work, and then decides to go back to the drawing board. At which point, Claire and Toby come in, having since asked him if he has a plan. But of course, Blinky points out that he actually has no shortage of plans, but he's having trouble finding a working one. He's having trouble finding a good one to get Jim out of the Darklands, because the reason being is that his current plan doesn't work because the Shadow Staff doesn't let them transport between dimensions. So they need the Troll Hunter to get him out. So he's currently trying to figure out a way to get Jim out of the Darklands, but which is not going well. But of course, they wonder how everything is going, and if they're having any sort of luck. And of course, they haven't really figured out any sort of solution to figure out how to get Jim out of the Darklands. Although Toby admits that he's been sticking his head in the fetch every single day until he could find Jim. And unfortunately, he has not been finding Jim. He's just been sticking his head in the Darklands and leaving him nougat nummies as he goes, to just as kind of an encouragement thing. Admitting that eventually Jim will eventually stumble across one and find one and use it for nourishment. But of course, they also admit that they wish they could figure out the situation with Jim and figure out how to get him out. But it's at this point where Blinky points out that that there was a saying his brother always used to say, that even the word hopeless is not devoid of hope. Which of course he points out that, of course he says it in Trollish, but Claire is able to translate it for us. At which point he points out that he did have his brother did have a point, and that they would need to eventually figure out where Jim is, that as long as they keep at it, they will eventually find a solution. And points out that for the time being, they should just continue to pour through the books in his library, so they can figure out just what exactly it is that they can do to actually rescue Jim. But as they're doing that, Toby notices that his Warhammer has shrunk, and he is a little confused as to how that happened, and demands to know who turned his Warhammer into a back scratcher. But it's at this point where Blinky reveals that he has actually been meaning to save it as a surprise, but he then reveals to Toby that actually he had made modifications to Toby's Warhammer after noticing during the battle with Angorot that he had been struggling with wielding it. So he both enabled it to become travel size so that Toby could carry it with him. And then he isn't limited to just keeping it in Troll Market anymore. He can stuff it in his backpack and keep it with him. So now he doesn't have to worry about that. But also points out that they stabilized the curse so that he can swing it around more effectively. And of course, Toby is very happy to hear that that his weapon now does a new thing, and proceeds to play with it a little bit. He starts turning it between its fun size form, as he puts it, and its normal size form, and he just starts playing around with it because he's very happy that it does a thing. But it's very fun. But in any case, as Toby's kind of just playing with his hammer, they hear alarms and stuff going on outside, and they wonder what exactly it is that's going on. At which point they all leave Blinky's library, and they discover that all of the troll leaders are in Troll Market, most of them we've seen before. There is one new person, Bork, who is from an unnamed Troll Market. I know she's from a Troll Market. They even describe what the Troll Market is, but they don't tell us what her name is outside the credits. And also, we don't ever actually see where she's from. She just shows up. She's somebody we haven't met before. But all the troll leaders we've seen before, and the new one, Bork. She's new. We don't know who she is. We don't know much about her or where she's from, but she is a leader of the Troll Tribunal, as we find out. But of course, the Troll Tribunal proceeds to, and of course, Blinky is curious, and of course, Toby is happy to see his Wumpa friend, but his Quagmire friend, but Wumpa just kind of half ignores him. She kind of gives a half-hearted hello before just kind of walking off and continuing the rest of the way. And also, we see the Krubera show up, and they're carrying a large mass of stones. We'll get to that, but of course, they proceed to carry the thing. They proceed to march through Troll Market toward the Heartstone, and of course, at this point where Vendel makes his season Part 2 debut, and of course, Blinky asks Vendel what is going on and why the Troll Tribunal has been summoned. At which point, Vendel explains that the Troll Tribunal has summoned itself. He explains how they've heard Jim went into the Darklands rather foolishly by himself, and they are there to discuss the destruction of Killhead Bridge so that he's no longer, a threat and will no longer let Gunmar out. Because they're worried that that's what's going to happen. They're worried that Gunmar is going to get free, and are worried that if he does, it'll spell doom and disaster. But of course, everybody objects to that, pointing out that that's obviously a bad thing, and they can't leave Jim stuck in there to die, because he won't be able to get out if they do that. But of course, Toby of course, Glendale points out that he's well aware of that, and that he's on his way to the rest of the tribunal now to plead with them and ask them not to do that. He points out that they're not going to go in, that they shouldn't go in they shouldn't go in and do something that foolhardy. So he's going to go protest on Jim's behalf. And with that, he leaves, and Blinky decides to tag along because he realizes that this is going to be that this is going to involve his protege. So he realizes he needs to be there and be part of the proceedings. And also, Blinky, and also Claire and Toby aren't allowed in the proceedings initially. They're not allowed in because they're human, so they have to find a way to sneak in and see the meeting themselves. But of course, as they're doing that, it then flips again to the perspective of the Darklands, where Jim is currently having his way through the Darklands, and he suddenly hears a bunch of goblins chattering, and we see a hooded figure leading the way. We don't know who the hooded figure is, not until the end at least, but it is a big reveal. But in any case, this hooded figure proceeds to show up and starts sending his goblins to sniff around the place. And Jim, realizing that he may be compromised, quickly realizes that he needs to erase his map so that they don't know how he got in and out. So and very hastily destroys the map that he's hand drawn so that he can, and then proceeds to escape deeper into the Darklands. Meanwhile, the hooded figure, whose name we do not learn right away, proceeds to see that Jim's hideout, sees that he destroyed the map that he was in, and realizes that the human troll hunter is there and that the bridge can in fact be opened. And then proceeds to send his goblins to go find Jim and bring him back alive, pointing out that they need him alive to open the bridge. And of course, it's at this point where the hooded figure then leaves to go inform Gunmar of what he's found. And he then proceeds to go to Gunmar's throne room, as we see. But we don't see Gunmar right away. I should mention, we saw him as a shadow, but we didn't actually see him. And in truth, we still don't, because his official debut is in next episode. We don't see him yet. But of course, we see Gunmar's arm, who's very happy about the fact that the bridge can finally be opened and he can finally get free after centuries of waiting, and orders the hooded figure to find the troll hunter and bring him to him. Meanwhile, Jim proceeds to fall while he's trying to evade the goblins, and eventually stumbles across the changeling nursery completely by accident. He winds up finding the changeling nursery and realizes he's finally hit the jackpot. But of course, it's this point where the perspective then proceeds to switch again, and everybody in the Troll Tribunal is arguing, and Toby and Claire have successfully snuck into the proceedings. But they're continuing to argue. That everybody's continuing to argue back and forth about the idea that Gunmar could get out. But and of course, Vendel is arguing the obvious point that if they destroy the Killahead Bridge with Jim in it, then he will never get out and could potentially die. And they're a lot more concerned about Gunmar getting out than anything. They obviously point out that if Jim's foolhardy actions have opens the way for Gunmar to get out, and that obviously it's not going to be a very safe place for the troll market. But Vendel points out the other obvious point. They have Killahead Bridge locked in a vault, and if Gunmar were to get out, he'd be stuck. He just straight up points that out. If Gunmar were to get out, they could easily lock him inside and then proceed to just, deal with him. Because he would just pop out of Killahead Bridge only to be locked in yet another prison. And they would just kind of wait for him and deal with him and ambush him when he eventually does come out, because there's only one way in and out of the troll market vault. So logically, he'd be fine. It'd be fine if he got out. They would have an army ready for him when he did. So it doesn't really matter. But in any case, Vendel points out all of this. But Ursurna, who is kind of leading this whole thing, does point out that it's obviously a problem. That obviously they point out that that's a risk you're going to have to take, and that they don't really need, and that Gunmar obviously is not a threat to be trifled with, and that a vault simply won't hold him. At which point the pile of stones that were carried in spring to life and form a familiar face. As it turns out, Gato, and this is something that just kind of makes sense in retrospect, but the reason Gato is here as an astral projection through a pile of stones, and here's why it's interesting, because it's kind of something you don't really think about. Gato can't leave Ojos Desolado. He is too big to get in and out, to get into the Gyre Station and leave. So he is just kind of stuck there and has to astral project to leave. He has to astral project to go anywhere else, which makes sense. But of course, it's at this point. But anyways, Gato, after forming an astral projection of himself using a series of floating stones, then proceeds to point out an obvious point that he feels like he needs to, a point that he thinks they should make. That he believes that Jim might be a changeling, and proposes that Jim might be a changeling going to free Gunmar specifically. Which of course Jim, which of course, and this is this point where Toby and Claire have had enough and come in to argue on Jim's behalf, and with everybody else arguing that obviously Jim would not be a changeling because first and foremost the Troll Hunter amulet would never pick a changeling. That's a thing. It would only pick somebody that it knew would protect the worlds. It would not pick a changeling because changelings, by their very nature, are made to serve Gunmar. They would never pick a changeling because the changeling would just let Gunmar out and render all of that a moot point. So it wouldn't pick a changeling. But and of course, Vendel points out that that's obviously an absurd claim to make. But with Blinky adding on that, and Bork adds to that there isn't any evidence otherwise. But Vendel then, it's at this point where Blinky then proceeds to get up and gives a very passionate speech about how how Jim has obviously risked a lot for their world. He is not only killed Bular the Butcher. He's captured Killahead Bridge, which is currently in the vault and is now the very thing that the Troll Tribunal seeks to destroy. He's also found the Triumbric Stones and destroyed Angerot, and also points out the obvious problem that Jim is now currently in the Darklands, risking his life to save a child from the Changeling Nursery. And start bringing them back. But of course, it's at this point. But of course, everybody kind of points out that that's not really that they don't feel like they don't feel like he's going to endanger their mission anyway because they're going to let out Gunmar. At which point, Toby and Claire do finally intervene. They finally get inside the proceedings and proceed to intervene and tell everybody exactly what they think. About how, and with Toby kind of pointing out that they're too afraid of Gunmar to deal with him. That's why they're destroying the bridge. They're too afraid of Gunmar to deal with him. But of course, everybody is. And of course, Gato isn't happy to see either of them because he points out that they're a literal pain in the rear. Of course, they insist that they reconsider and that the bridge not be destroyed with Jim in it. That's obviously a very big point that they point out. But of course, the Troll Tribunal doesn't listen, and Ursurno then proceeds to have her two Kubrera escort the kids out. But it's at this point where Blinky tells them that if they're going to force them out, then he'll have to force him out because he sides with their Troll Hunter and will not let them just throw him aside, throw their one chance of hope aside. And of course, it's at this point where the Troll Tribunal proceeds to throw everybody out, which is just how that scene ends. But and of course, it's at this point where we see Jim back in the Darklands, and he's in the Changeling Nursery trying to find Enrique, but he doesn't know which one is Enrique. He's just kind of poking around. He's poking around trying to figure everybody, while also trying to stay out of sight of the goblins. Because obviously the Changeling Nursery is maintained by goblins, which means they are all on high alert and are all making sure that nobody is getting stolen because they want to make sure all of the Changeling familiars are in their place. Jim of course uses the cradles to hide himself, but then proceeds to see a name tag called Eloise Stormhauer, which we find out was abducted in 1896, many years ago, over 200 years ago, I think. Yeah, easily over 200 years ago. But Of course, Jim wonders what exactly it is that they've been feeding them, and it seems to subtly imply that the formula they feed the babies to take care of them is keeping them young forever, so that they never age, and they can just keep their changelings outside in the real world, in the main world, in the overworld for as long as they need to finish the mission. But of course, Jim is and also I should mention, Eloise Stormhauer is actually an antagonist in the novels. It's not somebody we see in the story, but in the actual main story. But she is somebody that Jim encounters after this point in the novels, which is interesting. But of course, as he continues to navigate his way through the nursery, and eventually winds up at a nursery of a young boy who he winds up accidentally waking up, and he gives the young boy his bottle back, and tells him not to cry because it'll alert the goblins. But then discovers who the baby is. And he sees the baby's name tag, and discovers that the baby is actually the real Strickler. Baby Strickler, his little changeling familiar Strickler. But of course, Jim is happy to finally have met his mentor for real, and is happy to see, and is pointing out that he's so cute and small, but also points out that he needs to continue moving. And eventually, he does find Enrique's crib. He finds Enrique bundled up in one of the nurseries, and he does realize that he needs to get Enrique out. And we find out that Enrique was born in 2016, which aligns with when the series first started. It started in 2016. Enrique was born sometime around then, so sometime before the events of Trollhunters, but during the same year that it aired. So yeah, about then. But in case, Jim then proceeds to tell Enrique that there's a girl he knows that would very much like to see him again. He hinting to Claire, and proceeds to scoop him up out of his bed and goes back to hiding and trying to find his way out. But of course, in the process, he accidentally alerts the goblins that he's there, because the goblins see that Enrique is missing when he's supposed to be in his cradle, and they start shouting at each other as an alarm. So it's a kind of alarm system, which of course causes all the goblins to immediately go on high alert and look for Enrique. And Jim tries to escape, but in the process, he accidentally drops Enrique's bottle, which causes it to hit the floor and make a loud noise, and all of the goblins immediately see Jim and swarm. Which of course causes the rest of the game, which of course causes Gunmar the unnamed figure that we keep seeing to realize that Jim is where Jim is, and he rallies the Gunmar's forces, and we do finally see the Gum-Gums. They all look the same, but they have this black armor with green highlights. It is a very sinister looking armor, and that's kind of the point. They're the bad guys. They're supposed to look sinister. But of course, he then proceeds to rally the forces, and they proceed to get ready to find Jim and head him off. And Jim is currently running through the Darklands, trying to evade the goblins and now the Gum army, who are now hard on his trail. And he does do a bit of clever redirects where he sees the arrow. He sees one of the arrows he drew to mark his path, and realizes he can use it as a diversion, and throws his sword and sticks his sword in the general direction of where he knows a Gnarlagroth nest to be. And of course, they proceed to go look for the glow, and not actually Jim, when they get attacked by Gnarlagroths and get eaten, and Jim resummons his sword to keep going. Meanwhile, Toby, Blinky, and Claire arrive at the vault, where we find out Droll is guarding it, and Jim, and of course Droll points out that they really shouldn't be there, and that he's there to keep guard of the vault until the tribunal ends. But it's at this point where Blinky explains that if the tribunal plans to destroy the bridge, and that they need to let them in. And of course, Droll immediately sympathizes, immediately realizing that if they destroy the bridge, Jim's stuck inside the Darklands forever, and immediately lets them in, and grabs his axe, telling them that they're not going to get through, and that they'll defend the place till their last. At which point the Troll Tribunal proceeds to get ready to go into the vault, but Vendel sees them immediately, seeing that they're sneaking into the vault, and immediately insists that he forgot his reading glasses, that he needs to go back and get them. And of course, Ursarna sees right through that, pointing out that trolls don't wear eyeglasses, and wonders what exactly it is he's up to. At which point he sees Toby and Claire going into the vault, and she sees Toby and Claire going into the vault, and realizes that Vendel is trying to cover for them. At which point Vendel insists that they go after them, but then proceeds to trip the true Kybera up so that they don't actually go and capture the kids. But and of course, Ursarna just kind of realizes Vendel is covering for them. She realizes that. She realizes Vendel is on their side and is trying to help them. But and of course also tells, and of course this point where they point out that they'll need to destroy the controls to the vault so that Jim doesn't get out. And of course, Toby decides to use his newly upgraded Warhammer to just kind of smash the button so that they can't get inside. And of course, the Kybera proceed to smash on the outside of the vault. Meanwhile, and point out that with Joel pointing out that they're not going to get past. At which point the amulet starts glowing on the bridge, and they start realizing, and Jim is. And implying that Jim is close and he's about to cross through. And sure enough, we see Jim slowly navigating his way through the Darklands while being chased by goblins and gum-gums. And he is trying to get his way out. He is trying to figure out how to get out. But, of course, he sees the gum-gum hole. He also points out that he's not very good with directions. So he's having a bit of difficulty actually remembering where the bridge is. But eventually he does see it and eventually does make his way toward the bridge and starts running his full sprint toward it. Meanwhile, the Kyberas have since figured out how to break open the bridge and break open their way into the vaults where the bridge is, I should mention, and bust it open, and then proceed to bust it open, with Ursarna adding that they'll have to talk about Vendel's position on the council when all is said and done. But Vendel just tells her, in his own words, to kiss his mossy bottom. So he doesn't really care about what she has to say. But of course they then proceed to break it. But of course the Kybera proceed to get ready to come in, and while Team Trollhunter attempts to hold them off. But of course it quickly becomes apparent that the Kybera are just way too strong for the Team Trollhunter. As both Toby and Claire struggle to beat one of them, and Stroll is pretty much the only one that has any sort of fighting chance against the Kybera, because he's the only one who's kind of built like them. But of course, as they're battling, fending off the Kybera, they see that the bridge has started to glow, and Toby quickly realizes Jim is trying to come through. But of course, Ursarna insists that it's Gunmar, and insists that her Kybera break down the bridge. And of course, the Kybera immediately walk over to the bridge, not really caring about the kids, because they're kind of ineffectually fighting them, and proceed to get ready to smash the bridge. And Jim can see that the bridge is being broken up from his side. So he realizes that they're trying to destroy the bridge and keep Jim from coming through. And of course he's barely able to make it to the portal. With the gum-gums grabbing at him and trying to keep him away from the portal. But eventually Jim is able to. Claire realizes that Jim is trying to get through, and she also hears Enrique crying from the other side of the portal, because all of this is upsetting Enrique. So she realizes Enrique is on the other side of the portal as well, and insists that they not destroy the portal because destroy the bridge, because her brother's on the other side as well. And of course, she immediately jumps over one of the Kybera to get to the portal as it's being broken up. And by this point, the bridge has been broken to the point where the amulet falls out of it, and the portal is slowly closing. And of course, Claire is only barely able to get to Jim, and Jim isn't quite able to reach her. But he does manage to pass off Enrique to her, and she's able to get through the bridge, and she's able to pull him back through the bridge, but not Jim. So only Enrique. And of course, Claire proceeds to sob silently, pointing and tells Jim that he kept his promise, and that Enrique is finally safe. But while Toby is a lot more upset, because he tries to go at Ursarna with his hammer, insisting that she killed him. Insisting that she killed Jim, and is very angry. He is not happy at all. So, but of course, one of the Kybera breaks it up before anything happens. But stands the point. Toby is understandably angry because he thinks his best friend is dead. And And of course Usurna just kind of coldly walks away, her job having been done, and she rounds up her Kubera, and they proceed to just kind of leave. Meanwhile, Jim despairs at the fact that he was finally there, but then proceeds to get captured by the Gum-Gums. And of course, with the bridge broken, Team Trollhunters is now at a loss as to what to do next. They have no idea how to get Jim out of the Darklands now, because now the bridge is completely broken. Of course, they then proceed to wonder how they're supposed to fix it. But of course, and it's at this point where they start thinking about a story. But of course, Toby points out that the amulet hasn't called to anybody yet, and points out that if the amulet is calling to Jim, as long as the amulet doesn't call to anybody, Jim is alive and well. And it's at this point where Toby, who picked up the amulet, so it suddenly starts glowing and starts calling. And they're a little confused because it starts speaking Jim's name specifically before flying over to Arg's dead body, which is interesting, which they're a little confused by. Of course the amulet then proceeds to start speaking in Trollish, and they don't fully understand what it's talking about. And Blinky is also very visibly confused, not understanding what's going on. And of course, when Claire asks Blinky to translate, because she's not fully fluent in Troll. She speaks a lot of it, but she isn't fully fluent in it. It's at this point where Blinky points out that the amulet is just saying the troll is the key to the hunter, but just on repeat, on loop, not really explaining why it's saying it. He doesn't fully understand, but of course, eventually, and of course, they start racking their brains, and eventually, Claire figures out what it means. It means that Arg isn't actually dead and can be revived. And they quickly realize, and of course, Toby is happy about this, mainly because it means they can save his friend, but also realize that if they save Arg, they can save Jim as well, and realize that they now have a plan to get Jim out of the Darklands. They need to resurrect Arg, and in order to do that, they need to figure out how to, because obviously he was killed by Creeper's sun poison, which means the main way of them figuring out how to do that is to figure out how Creeper's sun poison works, so that they can undo it. That's obviously a main thing, but of course Blinky points out that that's a solid plan and that they need to work quickly, and that's because they know that Jim is kind of in danger and is kind of on a ticking clock, so they need to figure out how to get Jim out of the Darklands and soon. So they start immediately looking into it. Meanwhile, Jim has been tied up in chains and is currently being held by two Gum-Gums. At which point, we finally find out who the hooded figure is. Jim looks up at the hooded figure, and the hooded figure tells him that he was strong, but not strong. That he was pretty strong. But now that they have him, they'll finally be able to get Gunmar out of the Darklands. And of course, Jim looks up at the hooded figure, and then we find out that the hooded figure has 6 eyes and 4 arms. And Jim is obviously very confused. At which point the hood falls down, and we meet Dictatious Galadriel, who is revealed to be alive. He didn't actually die, which is, and again, the episode. This is elaborated on later about why he's not dead. It is elaborated on in Wizards, because Wizards elaborates on a lot of things. We'll get to that, but it elaborates on a lot of things that happen in the series. But for right now, just know that Dictatious is alive with no immediate explanation. He will eventually get one, but of course, Jim does understand who he's talking to, since he realizes that he looks exactly like Blinky. But of course, Dictatious points out that his brother taught him well, but not well enough, and then proceeds to knock Jim out with a spear, and that's how the episode ends. So yeah. Dictatious is alive and he's an antagonist. That's the twist that I think a lot of people weren't expecting going into this second half. Yeah, second half is the best way to put that. But yeah, Dictatious is alive and he's a villain. But of course, that's an interesting thing, especially since Blinky has spoken so highly of him. It's not fully explained why he's the villain. He's just a villain. They don't fully explain that right away, but clearly he's decided to side with Gunmar, which is an interesting thing, because it obviously, you don't explain right away why, but they do point out that obviously he's sided with Gunmar. He's seemingly sided with Gunmar, but we find out a little bit more about him later and why. But the way Blinky described him, it seems like Dictatious may be a bit cowardly and swore fealty to Gunmar for safety of his own life. We find out that out a little bit, but based on the way Blinky described him, that's the only real explanation, and that is exactly what happens. I should mention, we find out that Dictatious is a little bit of a coward later, but yeah, that's why he sided with Gunmar. But also, more to the point, now the Team Trollhunter now has a plan to get Jim out of the Darklands and save him. But also, the Troll Tribunal. We're going to talk about them. Because the Troll Tribunal are the ones that ultimately result in Gunmar getting out. So, yeah. Because here's the thing. Jim almost escaped. Jim almost escaped. Had they held off maybe 1-2 seconds later, Jim would have gotten out of the Darklands. He would have been able to escape, and they could have destroyed the bridge without any sort of risk to anybody. Jim would have been fine. He would have been safe. He would have been fine. He would have been able to get out, and they would have been able to plan for Gunmar's eventual release and eventually going to kill him. But of course, they didn't do that, which is going to become a thing later. This is the first of several dominoes that's set up that enable Gunmar to get out. That is the big one. They interrupt Jim's escape plan, which means Team Trollhunter has to go in and to perform another escape plan to make sure to get Jim out, which is of course going to be a big thing because that's how Gunmar actually gets out. He gets out the second time they open the bridge, but well, actually, third time's the charm, I guess, because this is the third time overall. That's the third time overall the bridge is open. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That doesn't happen in this episode, but that's a big thing. This is only the first of several dominoes, and it starts with first and foremost establishing that the Troll Tribunal is too cowardly to deal with Gunmar, but also pointing out that the Troll Tribunal is obviously we're so afraid of Gunmar that they would essentially doom their only saving grace. Their only saving grace is Jim, who is the first Troll Hunter to get the Triumvirate Stones assembled, and a bunch of other things. He's the first to get the Triumvirate Stones assembled and create the Sword of Eclipse, so that he can actually kill Gunmar. He's the only one who can. So yeah, there's a couple of dominoes that fall. They're obviously very untrusting to Jim, and in their own arrogance, they kind of set up the series of dominoes for Gunmar to get out. But that'll become a lot more apparent later when we discuss the rest of the other 12 episodes of the season. That'll become a lot more apparent when Gunmar actually gets out. But in any case, that's gonna do it for my review of Trollhunters. What do you guys think? Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below, or over on my Discord server, link in the description. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, be sure to follow me on Twitter in the description below. I mean, Elon's breaking it, but you can go follow me there anyway, because I don't know how long the site's going to be around for, but if you want to follow me over there, by all means. And also be sure to go check out my Discord. Link is down in the description. The one I want more people to migrate to, so please go do that. And also be sure to go check out my Twitch. I stream Saturdays and Sundays. Please go check those out. And also, not for a couple of weeks, because I'm going on vacation soon, so that'll happen next week-ish. So you guys will be without me for like a week. But, yeah, I hope you guys will look forward to that. And, but I hope you guys will I actually have been planning to stockpile my streams, because I've been meaning to do that, but you guys will see more of me. Don't worry. You guys will see more of me, but you won't physically see me for a while. But, yeah, and also, speaking of which, also be sure to check out my Patreon so you can support me. It's only a couple bucks a month. I do appreciate it, so please go do that. Link is down in the description. And also, finally, if you want to see more content from me, then be sure to check out the videos linked in the end screen. The top video is the most recent video. It may or may not be this video. Which the bottom video is the video recommended to you based on what you've already seen from me. So if you want to try something new, or see more of what you like, then be sure to check both of those videos out. But in any case, thank you guys so much for watching. Until next time, I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace!